This is Music Off the Record. I'm Dr. Ken Owen from Pierce College, and we're talking about the music that's going to be performed at the upcoming Northwest Sinfonietta concert, titled Bach Double Concerto. And so let's talk about that specific concerto. Again, there's other videos out there that we've done and posted. You can watch the one about Bach and his biography. As for this concerto, we're actually unsure when and where it was written. Part of what's confusing is that the oldest surviving music we have is from 1730. Now, if you watch that other video, you'll remember that at 1723, Bach started at a church music job where he remained for the rest of his life. So he wouldn't have typically been writing a lot of concertos at this time. But he did have a performance of this concerto in Leipzig for a weekly concert series that he was doing for the college that was there. But some scholars argue, and there's the angry professor there, it must have been written in Leipzig because that's where he was, that's the oldest surviving music, therefore it must have been written in Leipzig for this performance. However, not everybody shares this opinion. Other scholars say, well, this was a church job. He wouldn't have been writing concertos. Most likely he wrote it back in Curtin, the job he had before this, where he was writing concertos, and just took it with him and maybe adapted a little bit, and we just lost the original scores from back then. So there's our other angry professor saying Curtin was the instrumental music job, Leipzig was a church music job. It must have been written in Curtin. Either way, it's one of the greatest concertos, or at least most frequently performed concertos of our day, and exquisitely beautiful, so let's talk about it. Now, this picture that we've got up here is of a Baroque orchestra, kind of. I mean, the things weren't necessarily set, but you can see that there's a corps of strings and then some winds and timpani back there. There was not a set definition of orchestra on what it had to have. It varied a little bit from place to place and what they had available at the time. But one of the things that's a little different with a concerto for Bach than the way that we often see concertos today is that the soloists would have sat with the orchestra. So, today you go and see a concerto, usually the soloists are standing up in front. They might be dressed in fancier clothes, and the orchestra plays and the soloist plays, and it's kind of two separate things. Well, for Bach and the musicians of his time, it would have just been the violinist sitting first chair violin would have played with the orchestra and then also played the solo part and done kind of double duty. And the music, even if you don't read music, hopefully you can see how the second staff down here and the fourth staff down are exactly the same. One is the soloist line and one is the orchestra line, and you can see they're identical. And later when the first violin soloist comes in, you see again that top line and the third line are identical. So we see written in the music that they're playing along with the orchestra. Whether our soloists will do that at our concert or not, I don't know. But when the orchestra is all playing together, that's called the ritornello. So these Baroque concertos have a particular form or structure that you can listen for in the concert. So the orchestra plays all together. It's called the ritornello. Now that ritornello is going to come back. It's going to be maybe modified a little bit, shortened, but it's going to be recognizable as the same basic material. And that's every time the full orchestra plays. Now between those times that the orchestra plays the ritornello is when the soloists will play. Now, we say soloists, but that also includes the harpsichord and the cello, which is known as the continuo, kind of the rhythm section of the Baroque. And so we hear the ritornello end, and the two violinists will start along with the cello and harpsichord, and then the ritornello will come back, and it kind of alternates back and forth. Ritornello solo, ritornello solo. Ritornello is always the same music. Solos are always different music, varied. And so let's listen, see if we can hear a little bit of that structure. So again, in the score, at this point, the soloist would be playing along with the orchestra. And here's the soloist. You hear the harpsichord and the cello too. And here's the second violin. You hear them trading back and forth a little. So listen for when that ritornello will come back in with the full orchestra. It should be similar material. There it is, you recognize it? Same music, full orchestra. This time, already done. Much shorter this time. Back to the soloists. So this is how the first movements of concertos in the Baroque worked, although how many times it went back and forth was up to the composer. So you can count at the concert and see how many you catch. The second movement was usually slow and lyrical. Often they were meant to imitate opera arias. Opera was not quite, well, probably was 130 years old or so by the time that this was written, and very, very popular. And so we have two violin solos, so think of it maybe an opera duet, a couple of sopranos singing a beautiful opera duet. Let's see if it sounds like that. So one of the themes, the second violin soloist is on it now, is that long, descending, opera-like theme. And the other violin has been kind of this climbing up theme, and they tend to trade off and weave back and forth. You hear it? While one is long, sweeping lines, the other is churning and climbing. And on to our third movement. Just if you watch the video about Stravinsky's Dumbarton Oaks, this has that same little neighbor tone, da-da-dum motive in it that we'll see coming down. But also if you look at the music, and again, you don't have to be able to read music, you can just see that what's happening in the second line is exactly the same as the first line, just offset a little bit. So we have imitation, or one part going right after the other part, copying it a little bit between the soloists. And we'll play that here in a second. But eventually the orchestra takes over that theme that the two soloists have been trading back and forth, and the soloists have what we call double stops. Now if you can see the image here, again, if you don't read music, it doesn't matter, just notice that there's two notes in this line, which is for the solo violin, and two notes in this line for the solo violin. Usually violins play one note at a time. This time they're drawing across two strings at once, kind of pounding away those same notes over and over again, makes it very intense. Let's listen to a little bit of this. So first, that imitation. You hear that second one always take off right after the first one. So you hear those double stops. There's the soloist pounding 2 notes at a time, while the orchestra has the little figure that kind of builds up. So enjoy that, all 3 movements of it, just beautiful, and enjoy the concert.